So if you want to turn your attention to the screen.
So glad to have you here today. I believe today is going to be a defining moment for somebody. As we walk through the truth of the Scripture in just a few minutes, I believe, as I've been praying, I believe God's going to do something in the hearts and minds of all of us, but I believe somebody's going to have their life changed today, and I'm excited for that. Before we get into the Scriptures, and you can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is where we're going to be in the Bible in just a couple minutes. This weekend we call our Leadership Weekend, and what we mean by that is members vote for those that will serve on our board of administration, as well as our representation from here for our district conference that's coming up in June. So if you're a member and you haven't voted yet, there was voting online up until Thursday, and if you had an absentee ballot, it was supposed to be in by Friday. But if you haven't voted yet, please stop by the table out here, and as you sign for voting, also, there is a place there. Our denomination a few years ago set in place a process where we renew our membership every year. And so if you haven't done that, please sign that. Just check that you want to renew your membership. If you're watching online and maybe you miss voting, and that's okay, but there is an opportunity for you to let us know that you want to renew your membership. Just go to ehwc.org/renew. And that is a live link where you can renew your membership. And you can do that here, too, if you want to, just so we know that you want to renew your membership. I want you to picture this with me, what it would be like. We have two canvases here, and I did not paint these. I just want to be up front. I did not do this. And so you might be able to see them up there on the screen. But you would anticipate we have the same paints and the same artist. If I were the artist, I wasn't, but the same artist did do both of these. And you would assume that if you have the same resources and the same person doing this, that these two pictures would come out the same. And they did. And you can see they're very well done. And if you like giraffes in particular, you really like these. Now I want to shift for a second. Last week we talked about that we need to not raise our children, we raise our crops and our animals, but we need to train our children. And one of the conversations I've had frequently with parents throughout the years is this: how is it that I've raised my children, I've trained my children, and two sons grow up in the same household, and those two sons, that could be a son and a daughter or two daughters, but they grow up in the same household, so you have the same parents, with the same training opportunities, the same basic friendship circles, the same schools. There may be slight variations in that, but pretty much it's the same. And yet one comes out on a pathway that is following Jesus and the other one does not. How is that possible? How is it possible that one comes out looking this way and one comes out looking that way? And you end up a giraffe and a penguin. Now, if you like penguins, I'm not vilifying penguins. If people come out on a different pathway, we don't vilify the person. We have a heart that says, but I wish something different for you. How is it different? Let me show you how it is different. The writer to the Hebrews gives us insight. And talking about the Israelites, which we're going to be talking about them in just a few minutes, here's what the writer to Hebrews says. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those that obeyed. And there are many parents that have been guilt-ridden as if they somehow failed their children because they thought they were teaching them correctly. Now, there's times where that has happened, but there's many times where it hasn't happened. The difference between the outcomes has to do with the exercise of the will of the child. One by faith, one not by faith. In the same way, as we get into the scriptures today and we continue this series on Terminus, and this is not, if you saw the movie, this is not the Walking Dead Terminus, okay? This is talking about time. We talked about Terminus is either a foundational issue or it's an endpoint kind of issue. As we talk about the wholeness of time and how God desires for us to use time and His desires there for us, we want to look at time in the past. Here's a key thought for us today, and in essence is the question we'll answer. Are we taking advantage of and using time the way God intended? There was a Christian leader by the name of Thomas Monson. Here's a quote from him. Here's what he said. "The past is behind, learn from it. The future is ahead, prepare for it. But the present is here, let's live it." The past is behind, let's learn. The future is ahead, we've got to prepare for that and we anticipate it. But the present is here, let's live in it. Or if I were to rephrase it, I would put it this way. Yesterday is there for our instruction, today is here for our action, and the tomorrow is based on our anticipation. If we want to zero in this just a little bit more about the value of our past, and that's where I want us to look today, let me suggest several things that I think are important when we think about the past. The past gives us a head start in the present as we launch into the future. If we are willing to learn, and we're going to talk about that today, if we are willing to learn from the past, not just my personal past, but the past of other people, like I wrote this past week that my dad taught me a long time ago by his mistakes and by some things that we learned together, that you measure 3 times and then cut once. I tended to measure once and cut 3 times. Stop laughing at me, Rick. I see that laugh. He understands what I'm talking about as a very gifted builder. He understands that you need to go through the process. But see, if I learn that now, I can jump ahead and I don't have to learn that same lesson over again. You see, here's what I found. We either will learn from the past and it will move us ahead to the future. It gives us a head start because we start up here rather than back here. Or we say, I've got to learn it for myself. And then I have to go through all the mistakes that everybody else has made in the past before I can get anywhere. Or I choose to ignore the past or devalue the past. And in essence, by doing so, you stay stuck in your past. So it is all a matter of how we choose to view the past. So the first thing, it will give us a head start. The second thing, we get to see the consequences of decisions without suffering the pain of them. And one of the things that we're going to learn today is there were painful consequences to the decisions that people made. And we don't have to go through that. When I've had people and say, but I've got to learn it for myself, I think, why do you want to go through pain? Why aren't you willing to accept a story that's right here in front of you that is the very thing? But see, sometimes people are deluded. Like I've sat with people that have been in abusive situations and they're starting into the process of dating another abuser. And I'll say, but don't you understand? Don't you see what this person did with this one and this one and this one? Oh, but it will be different with me. He loves me. Why do you want to go through the pain again? But people do. The third thing I find is this. It gives us an understanding of how we arrived where we are. When we are willing to learn from the past, it gives us insight so that we have a better way to strategize about how we move forward in today. With that as insight into the value of the past, I want us to see how we can learn. And so this week in our conversation piece, I sat down with 3 elders. Now, I'm not talking about a positional elder in our church. And I'm not talking about elderly people. I'm talking about 3 people that I sat down with that have been following Christ for a number of years. And they have things that they can teach us, and we had a wonderful conversation about lessons that they have learned. But when I asked them to share their story and just at least one lesson that God has taught them, here's what they had to say.
I want to begin by, I think it'd be interesting for everybody just to hear a little bit of your story, how you came to know Christ, and maybe 1 or 2 core things that God has really sunk into your heart as you followed him through these years. So, Jeannie, we're going to let ladies go first. Why don't you tell people a little bit of your story, how you came to know Christ, and 1 or 2 things that the Lord has really taught you during this time?
Well, I really believe I met Jesus when I was 16 years old, and unfortunately, I followed him for a short time, and then I walked in the world. And I came back probably 20 years ago and really knew that there's nothing in the world for me, that only Jesus is going to satisfy me. So in some ways, it amazes me how the Lord can take those things that we do wrong, I guess, and turn them into what makes our walk so right, because, I believe like Peter did, there's no place else for me, but in Jesus. So all the things I did wrong only serve to make me stronger in him.
Sure. And there's a lot of people out here that can identify with your story, so I'm glad you're here tonight. Doug, how about you? What's your story?
Well, Pat, I used to attend the chapel years and years ago. When I was 21 years old, the Lord called my heart, and I gave my life to Christ then, and really been on a amazing journey for the last, I can't even do the math, but so many years that I've never taken a step backwards with the Lord being my guide. I've made mistakes, but he's always been there to clear things up and make it right.
Sure. Well, some of the first people I met when I ever got associated with Eastern Hills was these guys, as they were part of an interview process for me. Matt, I remember the first night meeting you. Tell people your story a little bit.
Well, early on, I've learned a lot about God, religion, who Jesus is. I learned about it. And then through a series of events in my own life, decisions that I've made, you can classify me as one of those that attends the school of hard knocks. I had to learn things the hard way until a breaking point in my life. And thank goodness, just through the grace of God, I accepted forgiveness. And not only did I know about, I came to understand who Jesus is. And it's been nonstop since. Total change, and I accept every day as a new day.
Yeah.
Despite of the mistakes.
Sure.
You can hear 2 things as I listen to that, and if you check in the conversation tonight, you'll hear this. The pain of going back on the beginning of a journey, you could hear that in Jeannie's voice. And I appreciate that because many people can identify with that, but also the anticipation of God taking me on through the next stage. Learning from the past so that we can get a jump on the present as we anticipate the future. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul is recounting such a thing. And I just want him to be our guide as we take a look at this. Beginning of verse 1, I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert. Now these things occurred as examples to us, from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Don't be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test the Lord as some of them did and were killed by snakes. And don't grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the age has come. So if you think you're standing firm, be careful lest you fall. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out that you can stand up under it. The end point in mind. No temptation has seized you, but such is common to man. You are not in any new and different circumstance that nobody can understand or that nobody else has faced. No temptation, no situation that you are in is something that nobody else can understand. No. Everything is common to the human experience. It always has been throughout all of history. But God's faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, what you can stand up underneath. And in the midst of that circumstance, He will also provide a way out that you can stand up under it. With that as our end point, with our goal in mind, starting with the end in mind, let's see how this is possible, and let's define some of these things. The important lessons we need to learn are these. First of all, just because we've been exposed to something and experienced its benefits does not mean that we have embraced its reality. Let me say that again. Just because we've been exposed to something and experienced its benefits does not mean we've embraced its reality. That's how one child can become a giraffe and the other one a penguin. Because they did not truly embrace what was presented to them. He makes it very clear as you walk through the passage. All the Israelites that came out of Egypt, all of them saw the 10 plagues that God used to free them from Pharaoh's clutches. All of them crossed through the Red Sea. All of them were provided the manna from heaven and ate that bread provided on a daily basis. All of them drank water out of a rock in the middle of the desert that God had provided. All of them experienced the same thing, but many of them, their bodies were scattered out across the desert, and only 2 of them, 20 years of age and older, entered into the promised land. Why? Because they did not put what they experienced together with faith. In fact, there were many things that happened, and he goes on to outline the many things, the many responses they had that are lessons that we need to learn from. And that's what we have in the second point. Our past contains types. That's the word. It contains types, lessons that we can learn from. And he said these things happened as examples. We're going to see that word down here again. It is the word where we get typos. It means something to learn from, or it can mean a warning. And it has the first in this instance and the second in the second instance. He said these things are written to teach us. And he goes on and says, verse 7, don't be idolaters as some of them were. The first type that he has is idolatry. And what is idolatry today? Because when we think of idolatry, I think of little statues that we build and we bow down to. And you say, well, we don't do any of that today. If you look at Exodus chapter 32, what we find is that it's the incident where Moses was a long time up on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments. And because they were impatient, we don't know what happened to this guy. Aaron, make us some gods that we could truly worship. So he said, well, bring your earrings here. And he put them all in the fire. He melted down the gold. He formed 2 golden calves. And they said, here are our gods that brought us up out of Egypt. Now, all of us are sitting here saying, that is a ridiculous thing. Oh, really? If we read through the Corinthian letter at other places, we find that they didn't have golden calves, but they were lifting up human leaders as people to idolize. Not Jesus, the human leaders. They were lifting up their giftedness as something to be idolized, not looking at how Christ had provided all of that. And all of us are guilty of the same thing. We have situations. We might idolize a family member. We might idolize our children. We might idolize our job. We might idolize money. We can put a lot of things up. Anything that will take your affections away from Jesus Christ is considered an idol. And so he says here, when you are tempted that way, don't do that. Learn from their lessons because it wasn't a good outcome. And you can read about that in the scriptures. Whatever we set up above and beyond our obedience to Jesus Christ is an idol. He says, and don't become sexually immoral as some of them did. Sexual immorality was rampant among them, we find. But in Numbers 25, they began as they started up toward the promised land. They were going past the nation of Moab. And the guys started having relations with these Moabite women. They were violating not only their own marriage bonds, but in order to be in relationship with these women and go around in all kind of dalliances with them, they would also go worship at the feet of their gods. And so they bowed down to the culture that was around them and got involved with things that they ought not get involved with. And we say, well, is that the case for the Corinthians? Well, yes, it is. If you look, he talks in chapter 6 about how you should not attach your body to a prostitute. There was sexual immorality happening. There was a guy that ended up in relationships with his stepmom, and they dealt with that. We'll talk about that later this year. But you see, when we bow down to cultural norms, and I've heard people that are involved in adulterous affairs, and they say, I'm fine spiritually, God and I are on the same page. I just want to lovingly say to you, no, you are not. You are violating your marriage bonds, your vows. And for all kind of sexual perversions that are around in our culture, again, my encouragement, my warning, the thing we need to learn is this. Truth is eternal. If we culturally norm and say, well, see, we've got to adjust the Bible to fit the cultural norms today. When you do that, the truth that you stand by today will not be the truth that your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren will stand by, because if you think the Bible can be changed to fit the culture, it will be different in their culture, and there is no truth. We cannot acculturize the truth. And so therefore we need to teach, train our children, help them in the conversations about these things so that they don't blindly accept just because of feelings. We need to help process feelings. I had several situations, but one was not long ago where we had conversation with a mom that was trying to help their child deal with some of the drawings that they had internally. And I said, it's a great time not to support that direction, but to train your child on a good biblical worldview and help them process their feelings. But they supported that child, and now that child has nothing to do with them and is in a relationship that they ought not be involved with. Why? Because we acculturate truth rather than standing on truth. He says, don't be involved in that, as some of them were. Didn't turn out well. The third thing he talks about is testing Christ. And don't put Christ to the test as some of them did. And they were killed by snakes. They complained about how God was this ridiculous food, and you brought us out here in the middle of nowhere, and is this what you brought us out of? We remember positive things about our experience before. They forgot all the slavery and all the whippings and all that. But he said, God, you aren't treating us well. And because of that, God sent a whole bunch of poisonous snakes in among them. 24,000 died in a day. And at that point, what we find is this, that Moses, as he interceded, said, God, what can we do? He said, you form a snake out of bronze and you stick it up in the air and tell them, if you get bit, turn to the snake. And when you look on that snake, you will be healed. Jesus took that same picture later on and he said this, when the things that we test God about now in our generation take place, we need to look to Jesus Christ. Even as Moses lifted up the snake in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whoever looks to him will be saved. So today, once again, don't go that way. Don't put God to the test. Don't complain against God and his provisions for you just because things are a little bit tough. Keep your eyes fixed on the one who has been lifted up, Jesus Christ, our living Lord. He said, don't go there. The last thing he talked to them about was grumbling. Grumbling. In Numbers, you will find again in chapter 16, you'll find this situation where there were some guys that said, Moses, who do you think you are? Aaron, who do you think you are? We're just as good as you. Who died and made you the lead? And at that point, God had a situation where he said, okay, everybody comes and appears before me, and he lifted up Moses, and these guys, Korah and Dathan and everybody that was following them, ended up dying. Don't grumble against leaders. Well, was that in the Corinthian church? Yes. Paul, who do you think you are? You're pretty tough when you write these letters, but you're nothing when you're around here. You see, none of this is new. There's nothing new under the sun. We have to understand that. And he says, don't go there. Learn from these things. In fact, here's the application from today. These things are here as warnings to us. They are telling us what the natural consequence would be if we follow these patterns. But I hope we're getting today that none of these are new situations. They are new for you maybe, but they are not new in humankind. These kind of things have been going on since the beginning in the garden. And so Paul just says, instead of going there, instead of following these patterns as they did, as the Corinthians were, take these as warnings, as instruction, as exhortation. Learn from them. Don't ignore them. Don't go through the pain of them. You see, warnings are not hindrances. Warnings are acts of love. When you warn your kids about the path that they're on, when you have a beloved brother or sister or spouse, and they're going in these patterns that are destroying them, it is an act of love to warn them. Not as a threat. God doesn't threaten us. He gives us warnings to help us avoid the consequences of our decisions. And so take these things as warnings. In fact, he takes it one step further. Look with me at verse 12. So if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. If you think you're in a great place, look again. Look again. I like this word, blepo. It kind of has a ring to it. It means to examine it very carefully. In other words, I trust God, I don't trust me. You say, well, that doesn't garner confidence. Yes, it does. Because I know, apart from Jesus Christ, where I could go. And quite honestly, I know, apart from Jesus Christ, where you can go. We all could go down that path if it weren't for the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ working in our lives. So take heed, lest you make decisions that are going to put you in a place where you will fall. Take heed. When we're taking heed and we're looking at this, and temptations are going to come. Temptation comes from external sources that are going to continue to bring pressure. And I know that some of our young people have said, please teach us about these things so we can have these conversations, because we all know that the very things that we just listed are coming at us all the time. Every ad we ever see that comes up on our feeds, every ad that we ever see on television or hear on the radio has one intent purpose, and that is to stir something inside you to want it. And that's what we find over and over again. But here's the good news. When you are in the midst of that kind of temptation, here is the great news of how much our Father loves us. Take a look in the midst for God's way out. Because no temptation has literally seized you, grabbed a hold of you, strangles you. No temptation that you are in, no circumstance that you are in. See, some of us say, but I've got great motives. You've got to let me alone because I'm not doing anything wrong. And we aren't willing to listen to the voices around us that God has placed there. Look for God's way out. Listen to trusted spiritual friends and family members. No temptation has seized you, but it's common to the human experience. Don't claim that you're the only one that has ever gone through this. But God. And I love those two words, but God. In the midst of the temptation, our God is faithful. He is faithful. He has been faithful in the past, He is faithful today, and He is eternally faithful to pull off in our lives that which He wants to accomplish that will be for our good and for His glory. So in the midst of any temptation you face, He will also provide a way out. Now, this is not like an escape room kind of thing where you can't figure it out. When you look, He by His Spirit will show you the way out. But what I find is that many of us don't necessarily want to take the way out. But He's faithful and will provide the way out so that in the midst of that, you can stand up against that temptation. What great news is that for us? Some of us are in the midst of a temptation right now. Some of us are in the midst of a circumstance where we're not listening to godly voices. And somehow we've justified our acculturation of the truth. And somehow we just think this is all okay. And I'm just asking you, by God's grace, take a look. Take a look. Lest you fall to a point where you don't want to fall. What I believe is that we need God's help to take a look. So here's what we're going to do. I'd just like us all to take the next few moments just to sit before the Lord and to listen carefully and say, God, search me right now. Bring these things up. Maybe it's shouting in your head right now, but let's let Him search us. And then I'm going to lead us in a time of prayer that may be a time of repentance. It might be a time of confession of something. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I believe that God is going to use that time to purify us in some way. What was the difference between these two? One responded by faith and the other did not. And my encouragement is that we respond to Him by faith today in what He's speaking into our hearts. Let's use this time as a time of meditation.